You know, in our everyday conversations, we throw around words like danger, hazard, threat, and risk like they literally all mean the exact same thing. We might say, oh, that slippery floor is a risk, or that bad storm is a threat. And honestly, no one bats an eye. It's just how we talk. But here's the hook. In the professional world, whether you're an engineer calculating structural tolerances, a financial analyst balancing a huge portfolio, or a public health official preparing for the next pandemic, confusing these terms isn't just a matter of bad grammar. It is a recipe for absolute disaster. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most complex, debated, and frankly fascinating concepts in modern intellectual history: risk. So here's the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The vocabulary of danger. 2. The math of disasters. 3. Cyber threats and vulnerabilities. 4. Risk as an opportunity. And finally, 5. The psychology of fear. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the vocabulary of danger, deconstructing the terms. Okay, let's kick things off by establishing a really clear divide between a hazard and a risk. A hazard is just a static inherent property. It exists completely regardless of whether anyone is actually around to interact with it, and its potential for harm doesn't just change on its own. Think of a massive dormant volcano looming over a landscape, or a great white shark just swimming peacefully out in the deep, isolated ocean. Those are hazards. Now, contrast that entirely with risk. Risk is a dynamic, contextual consequence. The risk doesn't actually materialize until a human being, or maybe a human asset, is introduced to the equation. Basically, the risk doesn't happen until someone decides to jump off a boat into that specific patch of ocean and actually swim with the shark. Risk demands context. It combines the probability of the hazard affecting us with the severity of the consequence when it actually does. So let's look at how these terms are actually operationalized to set professional guardrails across different industries. We already know a hazard is a static thing, like a highly toxic chemical stored safely away in a sealed industrial drum. But consider the term threat. A threat is fundamentally different because it requires an active, intentional, or dynamic natural force that is capable of exploiting a vulnerability. An active ransomware hacker intentionally probing a corporate network? That is a threat. It has agency, it has direction, and finally, consider uncertainty. This is an epistemic state, which is just a fancy way of saying it's defined entirely by the limits of human knowledge. When a novel viral pandemic first breaks out and we have absolutely zero historical data on its transmission rate or lethality, we're dealing with pure uncertainty. If a professional mixes these up, say by deploying a static hazard protocol for an active, evolving cyber threat, their entire mitigation strategy is gonna collapse. Moving right along to Section 2, the math of disasters, focusing on engineering and systems. To an engineer or a disaster management professional, risk isn't just some vague feeling or a random roll of the dice. It's a highly formalized, quantitative equation. Disaster risk equals hazard times exposure times vulnerability, and then you take all of that and divide it by capacity. Let's break those variables down to really see how they interact in the real world. We'll use the COVID-19 pathogen as a visceral example of this exact equation in action. The hazard is the intrinsic virulence of the virus itself, its baseline contagiousness and lethality. Exposure is spatial and temporal proximity, so how close people are to the pathogen, like riding in a packed subway car for an hour. Vulnerability represents who is fundamentally susceptible when they get exposed. This could be demographic factors or pre-existing medical conditions. But here is the absolutely crucial point. Notice how all of that top-level danger is divided by capacity. Capacity represents our redundant systems and our frontline responder resilience. Imagine an overrun city hospital at the very peak of an outbreak. The loss of a single critical emergency responder or running out of just a dozen ventilators drastically lowers that baseline capacity. And because capacity is the denominator, shrinking it dynamically scales the ultimate disaster risk massively upward, even if the biological hazard of the virus itself hasn't changed one single bit. Now, to map out these incredibly complex scenarios, reliability engineers use something called fault tree analysis. It's a top-down, deductive model. You start with the absolute worst-case scenario, say an airplane crashing or a massive industrial pipe rupturing, and you work backward using Boolean logic gates. Let's stick with the airplane example. A plane has multiple engines, right? Well, for the plane to fall out of the sky simply due to engine failure, Engine 1 and Engine 2 must fail simultaneously. That's an AND gate, which represents redundant safety features and drastically lowers risk. But an OR gate means a single component failure can trigger the whole disaster. If just one cheap battery terminal corrodes or a single vital wire snaps, the entire system goes down. Fault tree analysis maps all this out to identify and eliminate those highly dangerous single points of failure. Let's jump to Section 3, Cyber Threats and Vulnerabilities, the digital front. Notice how cybersecurity dramatically simplifies the civil engineering model we were just looking at? In the digital realm, risk simply equals threat times vulnerability. This specific discipline focuses heavily on an active, intentional actor, the threat, seeking out a specific flaw or weakness in your system, the vulnerability. The relationship here is deeply dependent. Imagine you have a massive, unpatched server vulnerability, but that server is buried offline in a disconnected basement where absolutely zero threat actors are looking for it. Because the threat is zero, your immediate practical risk calculation drops to almost zero. But the very second you connect that vulnerable server to the internet, boom, you introduce the threat actor, and your risk skyrockets. Both elements have to converge. All right, let's pivot to Section 4, Risk as an Opportunity, looking at finance and governance. We're going to flip our narrative entirely here, because there's a fascinating divide in the financial world between pure and speculative risk. Up until now, we've basically talked about risk as something terrible, right? A disaster to be avoided. And on the actuarial side of things, dealing with pure risk, that holds completely true. Actuaries deal with natural disasters and catastrophic accidents. In their world, there are only two possible outcomes. Either you suffer a terrible financial loss or you suffer no loss. There is absolutely no structural possibility for you to magically gain money from a hurricane hitting your house. But in the domain of financial, speculative risk, like investing in the stock market or funding a new tech startup, the whole paradigm shifts. In this domain, risk brings the simultaneous potential for massive gain, terrible loss, or just breaking even. Here, risk actually becomes a vehicle for profit. Which leads us directly to an incredibly transformative definition from the International Corporate Governance Standard known as ISO 31000. They define risk simply as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Think about that for a second. The effect of uncertainty on objectives. It shifts the focus entirely away from negative physical damage. It means risk isn't just an exploding pipe or a cyber attack. Risk is absolutely anything uncertain that impacts your strategic outcomes. And crucially, that effect can be remarkably positive. By adopting this specific mindset, a company completely changes how it operates fundamentally. It broadens the focus way beyond just dodging threats and patching vulnerabilities. Instead of just playing defense and looking at what might break, they scan the horizon for uncertainties that might actually reveal untapped opportunities. Let's say there's a massive disruption in global supply chains. Now, that's a huge uncertain risk. But by analyzing it proactively, a company might discover a cheaper, more resilient sourcing option from emerging markets, ultimately improving their overall competitiveness while all their rivals are panicking. Or consider launching a brand new, highly innovative product in a totally untested market. That is a major uncertainty. But the upside, capturing a brand new demographic before your competitors even realize it exists, turns that risk into a massive strategic advantage. It builds a proactive, risk-aware culture rather than a reactive, fearful one. And finally, Section 5, the psychology of fear, the human element. So, we've seen the rigorous math, the fault tree logic gates, and the strategic corporate frameworks. But it's time to pull the rug out from under all of it and look at how human beings actually operate in the real world. Enter cognitive psychology. Groundbreaking work by researchers like Paul Slovic established what's known as the psychometric paradigm. What they proved is that despite all the beautiful, perfectly balanced math we just looked at, humans simply do not naturally think in statistical mortality estimates or spreadsheets. We evaluate risks subjectively. We are guided by deeply ingrained intuitive cognitive maps and visceral emotional dread. To an engineer, risk is objective reality, but to a human brain, risk is a feeling. I mean, think about your own subjective fears for a moment. Why is it that the general public's judgment of a hazard almost always conflicts with expert data? Statistically speaking, you are in far more danger driving your car down the highway to the beach than you are of being attacked by a shark once you get there. Yet, we dread the highly publicized, sensational hazard of the shark, or a terrorist attack, or a sudden plane crash, far more than the mundane yet highly probable hazard of a fatal car crash. Our brains amplify risks that feel out of our personal control, risks that are invisible, or risks that have catastrophic, terrifying imagery attached to them by media amplification. We fear what we cannot control far more than what is actually statistically likely to harm us. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for this explainer. We've seen today that we have immense, rigorous mathematical power to quantify, map, and manage risk across engineering, cyberspace, and finance. Yet we are fundamentally a species hardwired to respond to emotional dread, lack of control, and subjective fears. So if risk is a mathematically solvable formula on paper, but the humans executing those formulas are ultimately driven by emotion, well, which one should truly guide how we design our public policies, govern our corporations, and live our everyday lives in an increasingly unpredictable world? It's a profound tension we all have to navigate. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of risk. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.